The kettle was still warming when my phone lit up with my brother's name. And I remember thinking, he never calls before 9. "Sarah, I need you to sell the house," Daniel said. No hello, no warm-up. Just that. I stood there in my kitchen in Manchester, tea bag still pinched between my fingers, and asked him to repeat himself. He did. Word for word. "You need to sell the house. Ethan's wedding is in 4 months. We're short £72,000. I want you to understand something about me before this story goes any further because I think it matters. My name is Sarah Whitfield, I'm 34, and I've spent the last 9 years working as a residential conveyancer, a closing agent if that term is more familiar to you. I read deeds and title reports and lien searches for a living. I know exactly what a land registry entry means. And I know exactly what it doesn't mean when someone tells you a house belongs to the family. This house belonged to me. Only me. I bought it at 29 on my own, after 6 years of putting away nearly every spare pound I earned, missing holidays my friends went on, driving a car with 140,000 miles on it because the down payment mattered more than the commute being comfortable. It's a modest 3-bedroom terrace in Chorlton, nothing extravagant, but it was mine outright in a way nothing else in my life had ever been. So when my brother, who has never once asked how my job actually works, told me to sell it, I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just asked very quietly, "Why would I do that?" "Because it's family," he said, like that explained anything. "You need to make a sacrifice for once." For once. I let that sit in the air a second longer than I needed to. Here's what you should know about Daniel. He's 2 years older than me, always the one my parents introduced first at gatherings, always the one whose mistakes got quietly absorbed by someone else. When his first business failed in his late 20s, our parents remortgaged their own flat to cover it. Nobody called that a sacrifice. Nobody called it anything at all. "I'm not selling my house, Daniel. You're being selfish. Do you know what people will say?" Did know. I could already hear it. The aunties, the family group chat, the same tired script. But something in me had gone very still and very clear. The way it does right before you make a decision you already know you're going to keep. "I have to go," I told him, and I hung up before he could answer. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that I'd already spent the better part of the past year quietly reviewing exactly how my property was titled, because of something I'd noticed 6 months earlier in a completely unrelated file at work. Name. A remortgage. Pattern I recognized immediately because I see it every single day in my job. Picked my phone back up. Not to call my brother back. To call my solicitor. "I want to take you back further, because you can't understand why that phone call landed the way it did without understanding what came before it. I was 12 the first time I noticed it. Not dramatically. Nothing about my childhood was dramatic on the surface. We looked from the outside, like an ordinary family in a semi-detached house outside Manchester. My father worked in insurance. My mother did the school run and kept the peace, or tried to. Daniel was 14, already the one who got introduced first at church, already the one whose report card got taped to the fridge while mine got a nod and a good girl. That year, Daniel broke a neighbor's greenhouse window with a cricket ball he wasn't supposed to be using in the garden. My mother paid for the glass out of the grocery budget and told the neighbor it was an accident anyone's child could have, conveniently forgetting it was the 3rd window that summer. When I broke a glass at the dinner table by accident 2 weeks later, my father asked me in front of everyone if I was capable of being careful with anything. I don't tell you this because a broken glass matters. I tell you because it was the first time I understood the accounting in our house wasn't the same for both of us. It kept going the way these things do, quietly, in small transactions nobody added up out loud. When Daniel failed his A-levels the first time, my parents paid for a resit tutor and told relatives he was taking a gap year to focus. When I got into university on a partial scholarship, my mother's first comment was, "Well, that's good because we can't really help with the rest." I found the rest myself, through a part-time job at a solicitor's office that, looking back, set the entire course of my career. There's a specific memory that I think about more than any other. I was 26, at a family dinner for my grandmother's 80th birthday. Daniel had just closed his first business, a car detailing franchise he'd sunk borrowed money into, and my parents had quietly remortgaged their flat to cover what he owed the bank. Nobody at that dinner said the word remortgage. Nobody said bailout. What they said was, "Daniel's had a hard year, we're just glad we could help him get back on his feet." I had, that same year, been promoted to senior conveyancer at my firm. I mentioned it once, briefly, over the starter. My aunt smiled and said, "That's nice," and turned back to ask Daniel what he was planning next. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I made peace with a version of it a long time ago. You learn to stop waiting for the applause that isn't coming, and you start building things for yourself instead. But I want you to understand the mechanism because it explains everything that came later. In my family, contribution was invisible. Debt was forgivable. And whatever Daniel needed became, automatically, something the rest of us were expected to provide. So when he called and said, 'You need to make a sacrifice for once,' that word once, it wasn't really about the house. It was the same script I'd been hearing since I was 12, just with a bigger number attached. Here's the pattern interrupt I want to give you because I think it matters. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, the one whose needs quietly moved to the back of the queue because you were capable of coping without help, you already know exactly what I'm describing. You don't need me to explain the feeling. You've lived it. What I hadn't told anyone, not my parents, not Daniel, not even close friends, was what I'd come across at work 8 months before that phone call. Part of my job involves running title searches and reviewing charges registered against a property. Mortgages, second charges, that sort of thing. It's routine. Most days it's genuinely boring. But 8 months earlier, a file had crossed my desk for an unrelated transaction, and a name on a linked search caught my eye because it was a name I knew. Daniel's. He'd remortgaged his own house, the one he and his wife Priya had bought 4 years earlier, twice. The second charge had gone through 11 months prior, and the loan amount was substantial. I wasn't meant to look any further than my own file required. Professionally, I didn't. But I recognized what that second charge usually means when it sits on top of a first mortgage that size, especially paired with a director's name I later confirmed, through public companies' house records anyone can access, belonged to a gambling-adjacent venture that had been dissolved within the year. I filed that knowledge away. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell our parents. I simply understood quietly that my brother's finances were nowhere near as stable as the family believed, and that the story we were all being told, the one where Daniel was the successful, settled one and I was the stubborn single sister with just a house, wasn't the whole truth. I didn't know yet how that knowledge would matter. I just knew it might someday. That someday turned out to be 4 months before his son's wedding. What they didn't know was that I'd already seen the numbers behind the wedding they wanted my house to fund. And those numbers told a very different story than the one my brother was telling everyone else. 3 days after that first phone call, my mother rang me. Not Daniel this time. My mother, which told me everything about how seriously they were taking my refusal. "Sarah, love, we need to talk about the wedding," she said, in the voice she uses when she's already decided what the outcome should be and is just walking me toward it. "There's nothing to talk about, Mum. I already told Daniel no. Don't be like that. This is Ethan's wedding. Your only nephew. You want him to remember his auntie as the one who wouldn't help." I stood at my kitchen counter, phone against my ear, and looked out at the small garden I'd spent 2 summers turning from a gravel patch into something with actual flower beds. Every plant in that garden, every tile in that kitchen, I'd chosen and paid for myself. "I want him to remember me as someone who came to his wedding and was happy for him," I said. "Not as someone who mortgaged her future for a single afternoon. It's not a single afternoon, it's family. You have savings. You have that house sitting there with no mortgage on it. Do you know how easy it would be for you to release some equity? You wouldn't even have to sell it outright." That stopped me for a second because it told me something important. This wasn't Daniel being impulsive and desperate. Someone had actually looked into equity release options for my property. Someone had done homework on my finances without asking me a single question about them. "Who told you that?" Yes. There was a pause just half a second too long. "Daniel mentioned it. He said you could probably get 60,000–70,000 out of it easily, given the area." I didn't answer. I just said I had to go and I hung up and I sat with that for a long time. My brother, who couldn't tell you what a mortgage term meant to save his life, somehow knew the phrase equity release and had a rough figure on what my house was worth. That detail didn't sit right with me. Filed it away, the way I'd filed away his second charge 8 months before. The real confrontation came 2 weeks later, at my grandmother's 90th birthday, the second big family milestone in the space of a year, and this one at a hired function room above a pub in Stockport, 40-odd relatives, a buffet, my grandmother in her good navy dress at the head table looking bewildered by all the fuss. I'd hoped, honestly, that showing up meant a truce. I brought a card, a gift, made polite conversation with cousins I hadn't seen in a year. It was going fine until Daniel found me by the drinks table. "Have you thought any more about the house?" he said, low enough that it was meant to be private, but with his wife Priya standing close enough to hear every word. "I told you and Mum both. The answer's no." "Sarah." He said my name the way you'd say it to a child who wasn't listening. "The venue needs a deposit by the 15th. We're going to lose it. Do you understand what that means? Ethan's fiancé's family already thinks we can't afford this properly. If we lose the venue, that's not my problem to solve." His voice rose just slightly, but enough that a few heads at nearby tables turned. "You've always been like this. Ever since you were a kid, everything had to be about what's fair for you. Mom and Dad sacrificed everything for this family, and you can't even release some equity from a house you don't even need all of." "I don't need all of it," I repeated quietly. "But it's mine. Every brick of it. It's family money whether you like it or not. You think you built that on your own? You had help. We all had help." That was the line that did it. Not because it was true, but because it was such a precise inversion of the truth that I actually laughed, once, short and sharp, which I immediately regretted because it made things worse. "What help, Daniel? Name it. Name £1 anyone in this family put toward that house." He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one, and the silence that followed was worse than if he'd shouted. My mother appeared at his elbow now, her hand on his arm the way she used to do when he was small and about to say something he'd regret, except this time it felt like she was steadying him to keep going rather than to stop. "Sarah, please," she said. "Don't make a scene at your grandmother's party." "I'm not making a scene. I'm standing here quietly while my brother tells 40 people I didn't earn my own house." Priya, to her credit, looked deeply uncomfortable, tugging gently at Daniel's sleeve, murmuring something about sitting down. He shook her off. "You know what," he said, and his voice had gone cold now. "If you cared about this family at all, you'd find a way. But you don't. You never have. You just care about being right." I remember the exact sound of the room after that. Cutlery, someone's laughed 2 tables over, my grandmother asking loudly whether it was time for cake yet, utterly unaware of what had just happened 6 feet from her. I looked at Daniel, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt something other than hurt. I felt something closer to clarity. "I hope Ethan has a beautiful wedding," I said. "I'll be there and I'll bring a gift, same as I would for any wedding. But it won't be my house." I walked away before he could respond. I found my coat, said a quiet goodbye to my grandmother, and left the party early. The first time in my adult life I'd ever walked out of a family event before the cake was cut. In the car, before I even started the engine, I opened my phone and looked again at the notes I'd quietly kept for 8 months. The second charge. The dissolved company. The equity release comment that had come from somewhere Daniel had clearly never thought of on his own. Something about that evening had shifted the ground under the whole situation, though I didn't fully understand why yet. It wasn't just that Daniel wanted my money. It was that he, or someone close to him, seemed to know exactly how much I had and exactly how to access it. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because I decided to fight back. Because I realized I needed to find out who else was involved. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call my mother. For the first time in this entire situation, I did the thing my job had trained me to do better than almost anything else. I went quiet and I went to work. The morning after I confirmed what the company's house filing and the second charge actually meant, that Daniel wasn't just short on wedding funds, He was sitting on a remortgage tied to a dissolved company with unpaid directors' loans attached to his name. I booked a half-day off work and drove to see my solicitor, a woman named Fatima Rashid who'd handled my original house purchase 5 years earlier, and who I trusted the way you trust someone who's never once tried to rush you into a decision. I want to understand exactly where I stand, I told her, sitting across from her desk with a folder of my own documents. The land registry title register for my property, my original completion statement, the deed itself. If anyone in my family tried to claim any right to this house, what would they actually need? Fatima looked at me for a moment before she answered, the way she does when she's deciding how bluntly to put something. Nobody has any claim to your house unless you've put their name on the title, given them power of attorney, or signed something creating an interest. A trust deed, a loan agreement secured against the property, anything like that. Have you done any of that?
No.
Never. Then legally, this conversation is very short. Your brother, your mother, anyone, they have no claim. Full stop. A pause. But I'm guessing that's not really what you're worried about. She was right. What I was actually worried about was subtler and, in some ways, more dangerous, not a legal claim but pressure. Family pressure has a way of working around the law rather than through it. People sign things they shouldn't under the guise of helping out, add a relative to a mortgage as a guarantor, agree to a temporary loan that becomes permanent. I'd seen it happen to clients. I wasn't about to let it happen to me. I want 2 things, I told her. First, I want written confirmation, something I can point to later if anyone claims otherwise, that this property is solely and unconditionally mine, with no encumbrances, no informal agreements, nothing. Second, and this is the part one need your advice on, I think my brother may be in more financial trouble than the family realizes, and I think someone has been giving him information about my finances that he shouldn't have access to. I want to know how that's possible. Fatima leaned back. What kind of information? I told her about the equity release comment. About how Daniel, who'd never once asked a competent question about mortgages in his life, suddenly knew the term, and had a rough estimate of what I could release. Fatima's expression sharpened slightly, the specific look of someone whose professional instincts have just been triggered. Have you shared any financial documents with anyone in your family? Bank statements, mortgage details, anything? No. Never. Then someone either guessed, which is possible, property values in Chorlton aren't exactly secret, or someone accessed information they shouldn't have. Do you have a broker, a financial advisor, anyone with access to your file who also has contact with your family? And that's when it landed, the way these things do. Not with alarm bells, just a quiet, cold certainty settling into place. My mortgage broker, the one I'd used 5 years earlier when I bought the house, was a family friend. Someone my parents had recommended. Someone who, I now remembered, had been at my grandmother's 80th birthday, and who I was fairly sure I'd seen 2 weeks ago, deep in conversation with my mother at the 90th. His name was Colin Wright. He ran a small independent mortgage advisory out of a converted shopfront in Sale, and he'd known our family for over 15 years. I didn't confront him. I did what my job had trained me to do instead. I documented everything, quietly, methodically, before I said a word to anyone. I requested in writing a full subject access request under data protection law from Colin's firm, asking for a record of every instance my file had been accessed, viewed, or discussed, and by whom over the past 2 years. It's a legal right anyone has over their own personal data, and firms handling financial information are required to respond within a set statutory window. While I waited on that, I went further. I pulled together everything I'd noted about Daniel's second charge and the dissolved company. All of it from publicly available companies' house records, nothing accessed improperly, simply cross-referenced and organized the way I would for a case file at work. I wanted a complete, defensible picture before I did anything else, because I understood something my brother apparently didn't. The moment you act on incomplete information out of anger, you hand the other side an opportunity to make the story about your behavior instead of theirs. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, because I think if you've ever found yourself gathering evidence quietly while people around you assumed you were simply being difficult, or punishing the you understand exactly the discipline this takes. It is much easier to shout. It is much harder to sit on what you know, keep your face calm at family dinners, and wait for the full picture before you move. 11 days later, the subject access response arrived from Colin's firm. It confirmed what I'd already suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. My file had been accessed twice in the past month, both times by Colin personally, both times with no active transaction or inquiry from me on record to justify it. The access log showed a viewing of my current outstanding balance, 0 since the house was mortgage-free, and an estimated property valuation he'd apparently run using an internal tool, dated 4 days before my mother's phone call about releasing equity. There it was, in writing, time-stamped, unambiguous. Someone I'd trusted with my most private financial information had looked into my house's value without my knowledge or consent, at a point that lined up exactly with when my family suddenly knew details they had no business knowing. I sat with that letter in my kitchen for a long time before I did anything else. Not angry, exactly. More like the specific stillness you feel when a suspicion you'd almost hoped was wrong turns out to be completely correct. What they didn't know was that I now had something far more useful than hurt feelings. I had a paper trail. I made 3 calls the next morning. Not to Daniel. Not to my mother. The first was to Fatima, to ask what my options were regarding a data protection breach by a regulated firm. The second was to the Financial Conduct Authority's General Inquiries line, simply to understand how complaints against a mortgage advisor were typically handled. The third, and this is the one that mattered most, was to Colin Wright himself, requesting a formal meeting at his office, alone, no family present, to discuss my account. He agreed immediately, clearly with no idea what the meeting was actually about. I hung up the phone and looked out at my garden, at the flower beds I'd built with my own hands and my own money, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since that first phone call weeks earlier. Not vindication yet, just readiness. Because the wedding, I now understood, was never really the whole story. Someone close to my family had been feeding them information about my finances for reasons that had nothing to do with love for Ethan or Daniel's desperation, and I intended to find out exactly why before I let anyone in my family say another word about sacrifice. The drive to Colin Wright's office took 11 minutes from my house, and I remember counting them, one by one. The way you count things when you need your mind occupied with something small so it doesn't wander somewhere larger. I'd printed the subject access response the night before, 3 pages, stapled once in the top left corner the way I staple every document at work, and I'd read it so many times the paper had started to soften at the edges like fabric. I stopped at the lights on Wilbraham Road and, for reasons I still can't fully explain, my mind went back nearly 15 years, to the first time I'd ever met Colin Wright at all. I was 19, home from my first year of university, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor while my dad and Colin, then a younger, thinner man with a full head of hair and a laptop bag slung across his chest, went over the numbers for my parents' own mortgage refinance. I remember Colin ruffling my hair on his way out and telling my dad, "She's a sharp one, this. Bet she'll be running her own firm one day." My dad had laughed and said, "God, I hope not. One workaholic in this family's enough." Nobody in that room had meant any harm by it. But I remembered, sitting at that red light 15 years later, how even then, even as a compliment, my ambition had been treated as a slightly amusing personality quirk rather than something to take seriously, while Daniel's far vaguer plans to get into property had been met with genuine enthusiasm and a promise from my dad to put some feelers out. The light turned green. I drove on. His office sat above a dry cleaner's on a quiet stretch of High Street in Sale, the kind of place that hadn't changed its signage in a decade. WRIGHT Mortgage and Financial Services in gold lettering that had gone slightly matte with age, one corner of the S beginning to peel. I parked across the road and sat in my car for a full 2 minutes before going in, not out of nerves exactly, but because I wanted to walk in exactly as calm as I intended to leave. I checked my folder one more time. The subject access response on top, my own title deed beneath it, though I doubted I'd need to show him that at all. Colin's office hadn't changed in 5 years. The same laminate desk with a coffee ring permanently etched into one corner, the same framed photo of him shaking hands with some regional business award committee from 2019, the same slightly too strong coffee machine gurgling in the corner like it was fighting for its life. There was a new calendar on the wall, some local estate agent's promotional freebie with a photo of Lime Park in autumn, and a small dish of individually wrapped mints by the visitor's chair that I remembered from my very first meeting with him as a client 5 years earlier, when I'd sat in that same chair nervous and excited about buying my first home, 29 years old and terrified of getting something wrong, terrified of a single number on a form derailing years of saving. He stood when I walked in, all warmth, all familiar family friend smile, the kind of smile that had made my parents trust him enough to send both their children to him for mortgages without a second thought, the kind of smile that had made me trust him too, once, back when I still believed that kind of warmth was uncomplicated. "Sarah, good to see you. How's the house treating you? Still loving Chorlton. Your mum mentioned you might pop by sometime." That last line landed differently than he probably intended. "Your mum mentioned." Filed away alongside everything else. "That's actually what I want to talk about," I said, keeping my voice pleasant, unhurried, and sat down before he could offer me the chair. I placed a slim folder on the desk between us without opening it yet, letting it sit there, unremarked upon, the way you'd place a card face down in a game you already knew you were winning. I'd learned that trick years ago from a senior partner at my firm, a woman named Deborah who'd trained me in my first year. Never open the file first. Let the silence around it do some of the work. Let the other person's imagination fill in what's inside it, because their imagination is usually worse than the truth. I want to tell you something about how I conduct myself in situations like this, because I think it matters more than the words themselves. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him the moment I sat down. I've learned, both from my job and from years of watching my family operate, that questions are far more powerful than accusations. An accusation gives someone something to defend against immediately, gives them a shape to push back on, an enemy position to retreat behind. A question forces them to either lie on record, which most people, even dishonest ones, find harder than they expect, harder than the movies make it look, or tell you the truth before they've had time to construct a better version of it. "Colin, when's the last time you accessed my mortgage file?" He blinked, the smile flickering just slightly at the edges, the way a shop shutter judders before it fully drops. "I mean, it's been a while, hasn't it? Since we set it up, surely. Why do you ask?" "That's interesting," I said, keeping my tone almost conversational, the tone I use with difficult clients at work when I already know something they don't think I know, because I have a subject access response here. I tapped the folder once, still without opening it, showing 2 accesses in the past 6 weeks, both under your login credentials, including a property valuation run 4 days before my mother called me about releasing equity from my house. The silence that followed told me everything the paperwork already had. He reached for his coffee mug, didn't drink from it, set it back down with a small clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office. Outside, I could hear the ordinary sounds of the high street, a delivery van reversing with its beeping alarm, someone's dog barking twice and then stopping, a child asking a parent something in the 2 loud voice children use when they haven't yet learned to modulate for indoor spaces. "Look, Sarah, your mum and we've known each other years. Since before you were born, practically, went to school with your dad. She was worried about the family, about the wedding, about Ethan and everything Daniel's been going through, and she asked me as a friend whether it'd be feasible for you to help out, and I just..." He stopped himself, hearing how it sounded even as he said it, the sentence collapsing under its own weight halfway through, like a bridge that had been fine right up until someone actually put weight on it. "You just accessed my confidential financial file, without my consent or knowledge, to answer a favor for my mother. It wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Sarah, you have to believe that. I've known you since you were in nappies, for God's sake. That's not what I asked. I asked what you did." I kept my voice level, almost gentle, because I'd learned a long time ago. First from watching solicitors far more experienced than me handle difficult meetings, then from doing the job myself for 9 years, that calm is far more unsettling to someone caught out than anger ever is. Anger gives people permission to get defensive, to match your energy, to turn the conversation into a fight they can walk away from feeling wronged in some smaller way, feeling like the aggression was mutual. Calm makes them fill the silence themselves, makes them keep talking long after they should have stopped, makes them dig without anyone else holding the shovel. "You're a regulated advisor, Colin. You have obligations under data protection law and under FCA conduct rules about client confidentiality. What you just described to me is a breach of both, and you know it because I can see it on your face right now." He went pale in a way that told me he understood exactly what those words meant professionally, even if he'd convinced himself in the moment, the way people so often do when the alternative is admitting fault, that helping an old family friend was harmless, that it didn't really count if nobody found out, that the rules were written for situations less personal than this one, colder, more corporate, more about strangers than people you'd known since they were children. He'd probably told himself a version of that story every single time he did something like this over the years, and I found myself wondering, with a kind of detached curiosity that surprised me even as I felt it, how many other clients' files had been quietly discussed at family dinners I'd never been invited to, how many other people's private numbers had been handed across kitchen tables like gossip. "I'm not here to destroy your business," I told him, and I meant it. This was never really about Colin specifically. He was a symptom, not the disease, a convenient tool someone else had picked up without asking whether it belonged to them or whether it was theirs to use. "But I need you to understand that what you did wasn't a favor. It gave my family leverage over me using information I never agreed to share with anyone. And I need to know exactly what you told them, word for word as best you remember. Because right now I genuinely don't know how much of my financial life has been discussed at kitchen tables I wasn't sitting at." He told me. All of it, in the halting, over-explaining way people talk when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you that what they did was reasonable. My mother had called him 3 weeks before the 90th birthday party, worried, she'd said, about Daniel and the wedding costs, and asked whether I could easily access money from my house. Nothing formal, she'd framed it. Just a friendly question between old friends over a cup of tea. The kind of thing you ask because you've known someone 15 years and the boundaries have worn soft in places. Colin, wanting to be helpful, wanting to be the kind of family friend who solved problems rather than created them, wanting perhaps to matter to a family he'd known for 15 years in some way beyond arranging paperwork, had pulled up an estimated valuation on his internal system and told her a rough equity figure, £60,000 to £70,000, without a second thought about whether he was actually allowed to. She made it sound like she just wanted a ballpark, he said, and I could hear him building his own defense in real time. The way people do when they're narrating their way toward an ending where they come out looking better than the facts suggest. Not like she was asking me to do anything wrong. It felt like, I don't know, like catching up with an old friend who happened to ask a work question over a cuppa. "You looked at my private financial data and handed it to a third party. Whether she made it sound casual doesn't change what you actually did, Colin." He had no answer to that, so I let the silence sit longer this time, long enough that the coffee machine's gurgling filled the whole room, long enough that I could hear him breathing slightly faster than before, and eventually he kept talking, the way people often do when a silence becomes uncomfortable enough that any words feel better than none. What he told me next was the piece I hadn't expected, the piece that reframed everything that came before it, that made the whole shape of the last 6 weeks tilt and resettle into something different, the way a photograph looks completely different once someone points out a detail in the background you'd never noticed. My mother had also asked him, separately, months earlier, around the time of Daniel's second charge going through, though Colin didn't put it in those exact terms, didn't seem to fully understand the mechanics of what he was describing, spoke about it the way someone describes a car engine they've heard is broken without understanding why. Whether he knew anything about Daniel's own financial situation, since Colin had also arranged Daniel's original mortgage years before, back when Daniel and Priya first bought their house in Sale, not far from this very office, practically walking distance. Colin, again without permission from Daniel, had confirmed there'd been some refinancing, but hadn't gone into detail, hadn't felt it was his place, he said. Though apparently that same reluctance hadn't applied when it came to my file, when it came to a number my mother could actually use. She just wanted to know if he was all right, Colin said. As his mum, I didn't think there was any harm in confirming there'd been a refinance. I didn't give her figures on his. I want you to know that. I did draw a line somewhere. You drew the line at protecting Daniel's information, I said. But not mine. He didn't have a good answer for that either, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite shame, not yet, but the beginning of it, the way a person's face changes when they start to see a pattern in their own behavior they hadn't noticed while they were living inside it. I want to pause here and tell you something because I think it's important. I didn't feel triumphant sitting in that office. I want to be honest with you about that. There's a version of this story where I'd storm in, slam the folder down, watch him crumble, and feel something like victory. That's not what it felt like. It felt more like watching a structure you trusted your whole life quietly reveal a crack running through its foundation. Unsettling, not satisfying, even when you're the one who found the crack. Which meant my mother already knew, on some level, months before that first phone call to me on that ordinary Tuesday morning with the kettle still warming, that Daniel's finances were shakier than he was letting on. And had decided the solution wasn't to ask Daniel harder questions, wasn't to sit her own son down at the kitchen table and ask what was really going on with his money, wasn't to treat the actual problem as the actual problem. It was to lean on me instead. Quietly. Persistently. Through channels I hadn't known existed until that morning. Using a 15-year friendship with a mortgage advisor as a backdoor into information I'd never have volunteered myself. Information that was, in every meaningful sense, none of her business. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something in my chest shift and resettle, like furniture rearranging itself in a room I thought I already knew the layout of. It reframed something I'd been turning over since that first phone call weeks earlier, the sense that my family hadn't simply believed Daniel needed help and come to me as a last, reluctant resort after exhausting every other option. They'd known, or at least strongly suspected, that something deeper was wrong with him financially, and rather than confront that directly, rather than do the harder, more uncomfortable work of asking their golden child difficult questions, they'd chosen the path of least resistance. And I was that path. I always had been, the reliable one, the one who'd absorbed disappointment quietly since I was 12 years old and a broken glass got treated differently depending on whose hand held it, the one whose boundaries could apparently still be worn down, even at 34, with enough pressure and enough guilt dressed up as family loyalty. If you've ever realized that your family's trust in you wasn't really trust at all, but just a reliable place to put pressure, you know exactly the moment I'm describing. It doesn't arrive like anger. It arrives like clarity. I'm going to file a formal complaint, I told Colin, my voice still even, still measured, though something inside me had gone very still and very final, the kind of stillness that comes after a decision has already been made somewhere below conscious thought, through the FCA's process, and I'm going to raise the data protection breach separately with the Information Commissioner's office. That's not negotiable. It's not personal, Colin. I want you to understand that, even though I know it won't feel that way to you. It's what the law requires when a regulated advisor breaches client confidentiality. It's what would happen to any client in my position, family friend or not, and treating me differently because we've known each other for 15 years would honestly be worse, not better. It would mean the rules only exist for people you don't happen to like. Sarah, please, this could cost me my license. I've got 2 kids in secondary school, a mortgage of my own, a business I've built up for 20 years. Please, think about what this would do to your mom and dad too. Having their old friend go through something like this because of family stuff. Then you should have thought about that before you pulled up my valuation for my mother, I said, and I stood, folder still closed, still unshown, because I hadn't needed to open it once. Sometimes the most powerful thing in a negotiation is the thing you never have to reveal, the leverage you never have to spend, because the other person's own guilt does the work for you far more effectively than anything you could say. I'm not trying to ruin you, Colin. I'm trying to make sure this never happens to anyone else who trusts you with their finances, the way my parents trusted you with ours, the way I trusted you with mine when I was 29 and had no idea what I was doing. What you do with that going forward is up to you. I left his office and walked down the narrow staircase past the dry cleaner's steamed-up window, and I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, the way I had after my grandmother's birthday party weeks earlier. Not shaking this time, not tearful, just processing the shape of what I now understood, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone in a garden to see what's living underneath it that you never knew was there. This wasn't a story about a wedding anymore. It hadn't really been for a while, if I was honest with myself. It was a story about a pattern of people deciding, quietly and without my consent, that my privacy, my finances, my house, the one thing in my life that was entirely, unambiguously mine, existed to be discussed and leveraged whenever it was convenient for someone else's unspoken crisis. I called Fatima from the car park before I'd even pulled out of the space, because I wanted her advice fresh, before I second-guessed myself on the drive home. She listened without interrupting while I explained what Colin had told me, and when I finished, she was quiet for a second before saying, "You did exactly the right thing, going to him directly first. Puts you in a much stronger position with both regulatory bodies. You gave him the chance to be honest, and he was. That matters." Then more gently, "How are you doing with all this, Sarah? This is a lot to be carrying alone." "I'm all right," I told her, and mostly meant it. "I just need to know how deep this actually goes before I decide what to do about any of it." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing a completion file for a client in Didsbury, my phone rang, and it wasn't Daniel or my mother. It was Priya. She asked to meet me alone, somewhere neutral, away from the family, her voice careful and low, like she was checking over her shoulder even over the phone, even in her own home. Her tone had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. Not the careful, conflict-avoidant warmth she usually wore at family gatherings, the peacekeeper smile she'd perfected over years of marrying into this family and learning which subjects to steer around at dinner, which jokes about Daniel's business ventures to laugh at and which to quietly redirect. This was something tighter, more urgent, something close to fear. We met at a coffee shop in Didsbury 2 days later, tucked into a corner table away from the window, the kind of spot you choose when you don't want to be seen, and she got straight to the point before her drink had even arrived, both hands wrapped around her cup like she needed something to hold on to, her wedding ring catching the light when her fingers moved. "I need to tell you something about Daniel's finances," she said, "because I don't think you know how bad it actually is, and I think you're the only one in this family who'd actually know what to do about it." She slid her phone across the table, open to a banking app, and what I saw on that screen made the picture I'd already built. The second charge, the dissolved company, Colin's careless valuation, suddenly looked like only the smallest visible piece of something much larger underneath. "Daniel doesn't know I'm here," Priya said, glancing toward the door once, briefly, like she expected him to walk in. "But I think we're about to lose the house. Our actual house. Not yours. I want you to sit with that for a second the way I had to. Because up until that moment, I'd believed the worst of this story was that my brother had asked me to sell my home for his son's wedding. I was about to learn that wasn't even close to the real problem. The coffee shop had that mid-afternoon quiet particular to weekday Didsbury. A couple of laptop workers by the window, a barista wiping down the same patch of counter for longer than it needed, the low hum of a fridge somewhere behind the till. I remember focusing on small, useless details like that because Priya's phone was still sitting on the table between us, screen dimmed but not locked, and I hadn't picked it up yet. I was giving myself a second before I did. "Show me," I said finally, and she turned it back toward me and unlocked it again. It was a joint mortgage account. Daniel and Priya's actual home, the semi-detached and sale they'd bought 4 years earlier, the one I'd been to for Sunday lunches, the one with the swing set in the back garden that Ethan had long since outgrown but nobody had taken down. The arrears notice was dated 11 days earlier. 2 missed payments, a third due in 9 days, and a formal warning paragraph in bold beneath it that I recognized instantly from 100 files at work, the language that precedes a lender instructing solicitors to begin repossession proceedings. "How long has this been going on?" I asked her, keeping my voice steady, the same register I'd use reviewing a client's file, because I could see she was barely holding herself together, and matching that energy wouldn't help either of us. "Since the spring, I think. Maybe longer. I only found out for certain 3 weeks ago, when a letter came to the house while Daniel was at work, and I opened it because I thought it was about the boiler service." She laughed once, a small broken sound with no humor in it at all. "I've been going through everything since then. Old statements, the online banking, everything. I didn't tell him I knew. I still haven't told him I know. Priya, I know how that sounds." She wrapped both hands tighter around her cup. "But Sarah, you don't understand what it's like. He gets this look when money comes up, this shutdown look like a door closing, and then he just deflects, changes the subject, tells me it's handled, it's temporary, it's fine. He's told me it's fine for 2 years. I believed him for most of that. I asked her to start from the beginning, and she did, and the picture that emerged over the next 40 minutes was worse and more specific than anything I'd pieced together on my own. The car detailing franchise that had failed when Daniel was in his late 20s, the one our parents had remortgaged their own flat to cover, hadn't actually closed the way the family believed. Daniel had quietly reopened a version. With 2 friends from his old football club as co-directors, funded partly through a business loan and partly, Priya now believed, through money he'd borrowed from a payday-style lender advertising itself as a flexible business finance provider, the kind that charges APRs most people don't read closely enough to be horrified by. That business had folded within 2 years. The same dissolved company I'd already found on the public company's house record, but the debts hadn't folded with it. Because Daniel had signed a personal guarantee on at least part of the borrowing, something Priya had only discovered when a letter from a debt recovery agency arrived addressed to him directly, months after the company was already gone. "He told me that was sorted," she said. "He told me a solicitor friend had looked at it and it wasn't enforceable, that they couldn't actually come after him personally." I believed that too for a while. I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I knew, professionally, exactly how personal guarantees work, and not enforceable is very rarely the honest version of that story. The second charge on their house, the one I'd first noticed at work 8 months before any of this started, had been taken out to cover part of that debt, an amount just under £30,000, secured against a property that, according to the most recent valuation Priya had found buried in an old email, had barely enough equity to cover it once the first mortgage was accounted for. Which meant, in plain terms, that Daniel and Priya's house was leveraged almost to its full value against debt from a business that no longer existed. And then, 11 months ago, the arrears had started. Small at first, a missed payment here caught up the next month, the kind of thing that looks, from the outside, like ordinary belt-tightening. But it hadn't stopped. Had gotten worse. Where's the money actually going? I asked her because 2 missed mortgage payments on a joint income that I knew, roughly, from family conversations over the years, should have comfortably covered their outgoings. That gap needed an explanation, and business failure 18 months ago wasn't a complete one anymore. Priya went very quiet, turning her cup a slow half-circle on the table before she answered. "There's an app," she said eventually. "A betting app. Football mostly, sometimes horses. I found it on the family iPad by accident, still logged in. There's transactions going back over a year. Small ones mostly, 20 here, 50 there, but some weeks it's hundreds. And there was one, back in February, for £1,100 in a single evening." I want to be honest with you about how I felt hearing that because I think it's important, and I think if you've ever had a moment like this, where a piece of information rearranges everything you thought you understood about someone you love, you'll recognize it. It wasn't shock exactly. Some part of me, the part that had noticed the second charge 8 months earlier and quietly filed it away without asking questions, had already half suspected something like this. What I felt instead was a kind of grief, sharp and specific, for the version of my brother I'd allowed myself to keep believing in even while I refused to sell my house for him. The version who was simply overwhelmed, simply proud, simply asking for help in the clumsy, entitled way our family had taught him to ask for things. That version didn't fully exist. He hadn't just been asking me to fund a wedding. He'd been asking me, without either of us fully realizing it, to fund a hole that had no bottom. What they didn't know was that the wedding was never really about the wedding at all. "Does anyone else know?" "Yes. Mum. Dad." No. Daniel would." She stopped herself, and something in her face made me ask the next question carefully. "Would what, Priya?" "I don't know what he'd do. That's the honest answer. He's not himself lately. He snaps at Ethan over nothing. He's stopped sleeping properly. 3 weeks ago I found him at 2 in the morning on his phone at the kitchen table, and when I asked what he was doing he just said, 'Nothing,' and went back to bed. And the next morning there was another transaction on that app." She finally looked up at me directly, and I saw, for the first time in the 6 years I'd known her, real fear in her expression, not the polite anxiety of family gatherings but something rawer. "I think the wedding pressure isn't really about Ethan for him anymore. I think it's become this thing he's decided has to happen, has to be perfect, has to prove something, and I don't fully understand what, but I know he's not thinking clearly about where the money's actually coming from or what happens after." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. My brother, the golden child, the one who'd never had to build anything from nothing because someone had always been there to catch him, was now standing at the edge of something he'd built entirely by himself, out of borrowed money and unexamined shame, and instead of telling anyone the truth, he'd turned outward. To me, to my house, to the one asset in the family he hadn't already burned through, because that was the only mechanism he'd ever been taught for solving a crisis. Someone else absorbs it. Why are you telling me this? I asked her gently because I genuinely wanted to know. You could have kept this between yourselves. You could have let this play out however it was going to play out without pulling me in any further than I already was. Priya's eyes went bright, and she blinked hard twice before she answered. Because I'm scared, Sarah. Not just about the house. Though God, I am terrified about the house. We have a son. We have nowhere else to go if this goes the way I think it's going. I'm scared about him. About what happens if this all comes out the way it's going to eventually come out anyway, publicly, humiliatingly, in front of everyone instead of privately, in a way someone could actually help him with. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, composed herself. You're the only person in this family who actually understands money. Real money, mortgages, debt, all of it properly, not just the feelings people have about it. Everyone else just argues about who owes who what and who's been more generous over the years. You're the only one who'd know what to actually do. I thought about that for a moment, about the strange, uncomfortable compliment buried inside it. The acknowledgement, finally, from someone in this family, that my competence was worth something beyond a passing, "That's nice," over the starter course at a birthday dinner. It had taken a genuine crisis for anyone to say it out loud. I need to think, I told her honestly. This isn't something I can fix with one phone call, Priya. What you're describing, the second charge, the personal guarantee, the missed payments, the gambling, that's not a wedding problem. That's a full financial crisis, and if it's not managed properly and soon, you could genuinely lose the house. And Daniel could be looking at far more serious consequences than an awkward family conversation. What kind of consequences? I chose my words carefully, because I didn't want to frighten her more than the situation already warranted, but I also owed her honesty, given what she'd just handed me. If the payday-style lender's personal guarantee is enforceable, and I'd need someone to actually look at the paperwork to know for certain, they can pursue him for the shortfall even after the company's gone, through the county court if necessary. If the mortgage arrears aren't addressed, the lender can apply for a possession order, and depending how the numbers actually stack up once you account for what's owed on the second charge, you could come out the other side of a forced sale with very little equity left, maybe none. And if he's using money that should be going toward the mortgage to fund gambling losses instead, that's not just a financial problem anymore. That's something that needs proper support, the kind I'm not qualified to give him. Priya nodded slowly, like she'd already half known all of this and just needed someone to say it plainly, without the softening she'd been doing for herself for weeks. So what do I do? I looked at her. At this woman who'd married into a family that had never quite made space for her either, who'd spent 6 years learning to laugh at the right moments and steer conversations away from the wrong ones, who was now sitting across from me with a banking app open on her phone and genuine fear in her eyes because she'd finally run out of ways to manage this quietly on her own. And I felt the last piece of my anger toward Daniel shift into something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet. But an understanding that the story I'd been telling myself, golden child demands sister's house, sister refuses, golden child exposed as ungrateful, was too simple for what was actually happening. You don't do anything today, I told her. Today you go home and you don't let on that you've spoken to me, because I don't yet know exactly how I want to handle this. And if Daniel finds out you've told me before I've had a chance to think it through properly, it could make things worse, not better. Give me a few days. And then what? And then, I said, I think it's time somebody in this family actually looked at the whole picture instead of just the piece that's loudest. I paid for both our coffees before she could reach for her purse, and I watched her walk out into the grey Didsbury afternoon, shoulders slightly less rigid than when she'd walked in, and I sat there for another 20 minutes after she'd gone, turning everything over. Because here was the uncomfortable truth I had to sit with. I now knew more about my brother's finances than my parents did, more than Daniel probably realized anyone outside his own head knew, and I was the one person in this family whose job had trained me for 9 years to look at exactly this kind of situation and see clearly what needed to happen next. Not out of spite. Not to win some long, invisible scorekeeping contest that had been running since I was 12 years old. but because somebody competent finally needed to be in the room, and it had never once in this family been assumed that the competent person would be me. That was the moment everything shifted, not because I'd discovered the worst of it yet, but because I finally understood I wasn't just protecting my house anymore. I was the only person standing between my brother and a collapse none of them could see coming. I drove home slower than usual that evening, past the turning from my parents' street, past the pub where Ethan's engagement had been celebrated 8 months earlier with a round of drinks Daniel had insisted on buying for the whole table, a gesture I now understood very differently than I had at the time. I thought about the folder still sitting on my passenger seat, Colin's confirmation, the company's house printouts, and now, in my head if not yet on paper, everything Priya had just told me. I understood, driving home that evening, that I'd reached the edge of what I could handle quietly, on my own, in solicitors' offices and coffee shops. What came next would need to involve my parents whether I wanted it to or not. Not because I owed Daniel a rescue, but because somebody was going to have to tell them the truth before the bank did it for them, in a letter, in front of everyone in the worst possible way. I just didn't yet know how to do that without becoming, once again, the villain of a story that was never mine to begin with. I didn't call a family meeting. I've never liked the phrase, and I didn't want this to feel like a tribunal, with me standing at the front holding evidence like a barrister making a case. Instead, I called my parents and asked if I could come round on Sunday, just the three of us, no wedding talk, I said, just something I needed to discuss properly. I brought the folder. I didn't open it right away. I sat at the same kitchen table I'd eaten 1,000 dinners at as a child, the one where a broken glass had once meant 2 different things depending on whose hand dropped it, and I told my parents, calmly and in order, everything I knew. The second charge. The dissolved company and the personal guarantee. Colin and what he'd accessed and why. And then, carefully, because it wasn't fully my story to tell, I told them what Priya had shared with me. The arrears, the app, the £1,100 in a single February evening. My mother went very pale. My father didn't say anything for a long time, just turned his mug of tea in slow circles the way Priya had turned her coffee cup 2 weeks earlier, as if the whole family had inherited the same nervous habit for the same kind of moment. Why didn't he tell us? My mother finally asked, and I understood, hearing the genuine bewilderment in her voice, that some part of her still hadn't connected her own equity release phone call to the reason Daniel hadn't felt able to simply say the truth out loud. Because you've never once let him be the one who struggles, I said, as gently as I could manage. Not really. Every time it got hard, somebody quietly caught him before he hit the ground. And I don't think he ever learned what it's like to ask for help honestly instead of finding a way to make the problem someone else's to solve. I didn't say the rest of what I was thinking, which was that I'd learned the opposite lesson so thoroughly it had taken me until I was 34 to stop apologizing for having built something solid. What happened over the following 6 weeks wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no single explosive confrontation, no one storming out of a restaurant. It was slower and, in its own way, harder. My parents sat Daniel down. Not me, I made that clear from the start. This needed to come from them, and the truth came out in full. The personal guarantee, which a proper solicitor confirmed was indeed enforceable. The arrears, now at 3 missed payments and a formal possession warning. And the betting app, which Daniel, to his credit, didn't try to minimize once it was finally on the table in front of him. The wedding venue deposit was never paid. Ethan and his fiancée quietly moved the date back 8 months and scaled everything down to something they could actually afford themselves. And if you'd asked me a year earlier whether that would feel like a victory, I'd have said the idea was absurd. It felt, instead, like the first honest thing that had happened in this family in years. Daniel and Priya didn't lose the house in the end, though it was close. A structured repayment arrangement with a mortgage lender, negotiated with proper advice this time rather than another quiet family bailout, bought them breathing room. The personal guarantee debt was consolidated into a formal repayment plan through a debt management process rather than left to spiral through recovery agents. And Daniel, at Priya's insistence and, I think, his own quiet relief at finally being made to face it, started attending a structured support program for problem gambling. Colin's situation resolved separately from all of this, and less gently. My formal complaint was upheld. The Information Commissioner's office confirmed the unauthorized access constituted a data protection breach, and the FCA's review of his conduct resulted in a formal warning on his file and a mandated compliance retraining period, along with a requirement that his firm implement stricter access controls. The kind of outcome that doesn't end a career but does end a certain kind of casual, boundary-free trust nobody should have been extending in the first place. My mother apologized to me eventually in her own way, on a quiet Tuesday evening months later, not with a grand speech but with a single sentence over the phone. I shouldn't have asked Colin that. I should have asked you directly. And I should have accepted no the first time you said it. It wasn't everything. But it was more honesty than I'd received from her in over a decade, and I decided to let that be enough. I still live in that house in Chorlton. The garden's coming along nicely this year. I finally got the roses to take. Daniel and I talk now, occasionally, carefully, in a way that feels newer and more honest than anything we had before, built less on old roles and more on two adults slowly figuring out how to actually know each other. If you've ever been the reliable one in your family, the one whose no somehow always mattered less than everyone else's crisis, I hope you hear this clearly. Competence is not an obligation. Being capable of helping was never the same thing as being required to. The version of me who almost believed that, who nearly let guilt do what love should have done freely, is not a version I miss. I didn't make a sacrifice that year. I made a decision. And on the other side of it, for the first time in a long time, I finally feel like my own. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from. And if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, I hope you remember, that was never the truth about you.